The Mafia boss left a $0 tip, but the single mom waitress found a secret note under his plate that would change her life forever. The moment Harriette Morris lifted that porcelain plate and saw what Costa Vladimiro had left behind, everything changed. She had served the city's most feared man dozens of times. Nothing more than brief nods, clipped orders, black coffee. But the way her hands trembled as she unfolded that napkin, as her eyes traced the words written in sharp, decisive ink, made it clear that nothing about this moment was ordinary. And what was written on that note? No one, not even Harriette, was ready for it. Before continuing the story, please consider giving this video a like, share it, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps bring more stories to you. Everyone in that diner knew that Costa Vladimiro did not leave tips. He left impressions. He made statements. People remembered. That was why the entire floor seemed to hold its breath when his booth went empty and Harriette approached the table with slow, exhausted steps. Harriette Morris looked down at the check presenter, her apron stained with coffee and ketchup from the dinner rush. She had been on her feet since noon, juggling orders, soothing customers, and sneaking to the back every 20 minutes to check on Susan, who was sleeping fitfully in her carrier beside the broken freezer. Her hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her uniform too worn to be noticed. Her face too tired to be remembered. People rarely looked at her twice. But Costa Vladimiro had looked. Every time. And tonight, he had left her nothing. She stared at the blank tip line. $0. 0 cents. The rent was due in 3 days. The electricity bill in 5. Susan needed formula. The weight of it pressed down on her chest like a stone. She blinked hard, refusing to let the tears come, and reached for the plate to clear the table. That was when she saw it. Tucked beneath the heavy white porcelain, folded once, twice, 3 times, was a napkin. And resting on top of it, holding it in place like an anchor, was a signet ring, gold, heavy, engraved with a symbol she had only seen whispered about in the shadows of the city. Harriette's breath caught. Her fingers hovered over the napkin. The diner's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Somewhere in the back, Susan began to cry. She lifted the ring, unfolded the note, and read the words that would shatter her world. The debt is paid. Your brother died protecting me. Now I protect what he loved most. Look closer. Taped to the underside of the table was a key. And beside it, folded tight, a legal document with her name on it. An address she didn't recognize. A signature she would never forget. Costa Vladimiro hadn't left her a tip. He had left her a life. The diners smelled like burnt coffee and regret. It always did after 9 p.m., when the last of the construction workers had cleared out and the only customers left were the ones with nowhere else to go. Harriette had learned to read the clock by the ache in her feet. By 10, it was a dull throb. By 11, a sharp pulse that climbed up her calves. Tonight, it was barely 9:30, and she already felt like she'd walked across the city twice. Susan's cry cut through the kitchen like a knife. Harriette froze mid-pour, the coffee pot hovering over Mrs. Chen's cup. The older woman waved her off with a weathered hand. Go, go. Baby needs you more than I need caffeine. She didn't wait for permission twice. The pot clattered onto the burner as she pushed through the swinging door into the back. Susan was red-faced in her carrier, tiny fists batting at nothing, her whole body trembling with the force of her wails. Harriette scooped her up, pressing her daughter's warm weight against her chest, swaying in the cramped space between the industrial sink and the broken freezer that hadn't worked since March. Shoo, Mama's here, she whispered, though the words felt hollow. Mama was always here, but here was never enough. Here didn't pay rent. Here didn't keep the lights on. The bell above the door chimed. Harriette's stomach dropped. She glanced at the clock. 9:42. He was early tonight. She settled Susan back into the carrier with practiced speed, tucking the pacifier between those tiny, angry lips. The crying subsided into hiccups, then silence. Harriette smoothed her apron, tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, and stepped back onto the floor. Costa Vladimiro sat in the corner booth like he owned it. Like he owned the whole damn building, which, for all Harriette knew, he probably did. He didn't look up when she approached. He never did at first. Just sat there in his perfectly tailored black coat, hands folded on the table, expression carved from stone. The diner had emptied in the 5 minutes she'd been gone. Mrs. Chen's booth was vacant, her usual $2 tucked under the saucer. The college kid who'd been nursing a Coke for 2 hours had vanished. Even Jerry, the night cook, had made himself scarce, retreating to the alley for a smoke he didn't need. People didn't stay when Costa Vladimiro arrived. They knew better. Harriette pulled out her pad, though she didn't need it. "Evening, Mr. Vladimiro." The usual. His eyes lifted then. Dark, unreadable, set in a face that might have been handsome if it weren't so cold. He studied her for 3 seconds that felt like 3 hours. Black coffee. Eggs scrambled. Wheat toast dry. Coming right up. Her hands didn't shake when she wrote it down, though they wanted to. She'd been serving him for 6 weeks now, every Tuesday and Thursday like clockwork. He never varied his order. Never stayed longer than 20 minutes. Never spoke more than necessary. And never, ever left a tip. At first, she'd thought it was personal. Some kind of test or punishment for a slight she didn't remember giving. But she'd asked around, carefully, quietly, and learned that Costa Vladimiro didn't tip anyone. It wasn't cruelty. It was principle. Something about not participating in a corrupt system that underpaid workers. She didn't understand it, didn't care to. All she knew was that her Tuesday and Thursday nights were always $50 shorter than they should be. The order took 12 minutes. She brought it to him in silence, set the plate down with the mechanical precision of someone who'd done this 10,000 times. He didn't acknowledge her. Just picked up his fork and began to eat with the same deliberate, controlled movements he did everything with. Harriette retreated to the counter, pretending to organize receipt paper while watching him from the corner of her eye. He ate slowly, methodically. Cut each bite of egg into identical squares. Took exactly 3 sips of coffee between each forkful. When he finished, he dabbed his mouth with the napkin once, folded it precisely in half, and placed it on the plate. Then he stood, buttoned his coat, and walked out without a word. The bell chimed. The door swung shut. Silence rushed in like water filling a grave. Harriette exhaled and crossed to the booth. The check presenter lay closed on the table, $47.36 for food he could have bought anywhere else, at any upscale restaurant where people like him belonged. She flipped it open. The tip line was blank. Not just blank, aggressively blank, with a single firm line drawn through it and a 0 written above in dark, decisive ink. $0. 0 cents. Something hot and bitter rose in her throat. The rent notice had come yesterday, printed in red letters that seemed to scream from the envelope. $300 by Friday, or they were out. She'd been counting on this week's tips to make up the difference. Had been stupid enough to hope. She reached for the plate with numb fingers, vision blurring at the edges. That was when she saw it. The napkin wasn't just folded. It was weighted down, pressed flat against the porcelain by something that caught the diner's fluorescent light and threw it back in sharp, golden angles. A ring. Harriette's breath stopped. Her hand hovered over it, trembling now, really trembling. The ring was heavy, old, engraved with a symbol she'd seen on news reports and whispered about in grocery store lines, a serpent coiled around a sword. She picked it up. It was warm, as if it had been worn recently. Beneath it, the napkin had words written in the same sharp, precise handwriting from the check. "The debt is paid. Look closer." Her heart hammered against her ribs. Look closer. Look where? She lifted the plate with both hands, tilted it, and that's when she saw them. Taped to the underside of the table. A key on a simple metal ring. And folded beside it, crisp and official, a legal document with her full name typed across the top. Harriette Morris. Her vision tunneled. The diner spun. Somewhere far away, Susan began to cry again, but Harriette couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but stare at the address written on the document and the signature at the bottom. Costa Vladimiro hadn't left her a tip. He'd left her everything. Harriette didn't sleep that night. She couldn't. The key sat on her nightstand like a live grenade, catching moonlight through the thin curtains of her studio apartment, if it could even be called that. One room. A hot plate that worked half the time. A bathroom with tiles that hadn't been white since the 90s. Susan's crib took up most of the space that wasn't occupied by Harriette's mattress on the floor. The legal document lay beside the key, still folded, though she'd read it 17 times. Warranty deed. Transfer of property. For 12 Maple Street, Unit 3B. Her name, typed in official black ink. Costa Vladimiro's signature, bold and unmistakable. A notary seal from 3 days ago, which meant he'd planned this. Had known he was going to leave it for her before he ever sat down in that booth. The paper said she owned it. Owned an apartment she'd never seen in a building she'd never heard of. Free and clear. No mortgage. No liens. Just hers. It didn't make sense. Nothing about this made sense. By the time dawn crept through the curtains, Harriette had made her decision. She would go to the address. She would see what kind of trap or trick or cruel joke this was. And then she would find a way to give it all back, because people like Costa Vladimiro didn't give things away. They made investments. And Harriette Morris couldn't afford the interest. She fed Susan, changed her, packed the diaper bag with the mechanical efficiency of exhaustion. The key went into her jacket pocket. The deed stayed in the bag, folded inside a water-damaged copy of Goodnight Moon like some kind of sacred text she was afraid to lose. The bus ride took 40 minutes. Harriette watched the city transform outside the smudged window, her neighborhood's crumbling facades and chain-link fences gradually giving way to tree-lined streets and brick buildings with actual maintenance. By the time she reached Maple Street, Susan had fallen asleep against her chest in the carrier, tiny breaths warm and steady. Number 412 was a 3-story walk-up painted cream and forest green. Not luxury, but solid. Real. The kind of building where the front steps were swept and the mailboxes had all their doors. A woman in yoga pants was leaving as Harriette approached, holding the door open with a smile that looked genuine. "Thanks," Harriette mumbled, slipping inside before she could lose her nerve. The lobby smelled like lemon cleaner. Actual cleaner, not the industrial chemicals that burned your nose. There was a bulletin board with community announcements, a tiny table with a vase of fresh flowers. Harriette's reflection stared back at her from a mirror on the wall, pale, underfed, wearing a coat with a broken zipper and boots that were more duct tape than leather. She didn't belong here. Unit 3B was on the 3rd floor. Harriette climbed slowly, one hand on Susan, the other trailing along a banister that didn't wobble. The hallway at the top was quiet, carpeted, lit by soft overhead lights that didn't flicker. She found the door halfway down. Stood in front of it for a full minute, key burning in her palm. This was insane. She should leave. Should go to the police, or a lawyer, or literally anyone who could explain what was happening and why a man who crushed people under his heel was handing her property like it meant nothing. Susan stirred against her chest with a small, sleepy sound. Harriette put the key in the lock. It turned smoothly. The door swung open on silent hinges. The apartment exhaled light. That was Harriette's first thought, that somehow light lived here, in the way it poured through 2 large windows overlooking a street with actual trees. The space wasn't huge, but it was clean. A living room with hardwood floors and fresh paint. A kitchen with appliances that looked like they'd been installed this decade. A hallway leading to what had to be a bedroom, maybe 2. She stepped inside on numb legs. The door clicked shut behind her. Everything was furnished. Not extravagantly, but carefully, a couch in soft gray, a coffee table, a rug that looked new. In the kitchen, the cabinets were stocked. She opened one with shaking hands and found plates, glasses, mugs. The next had dry goods. Rice. Pasta. Canned vegetables. Formula. Harriette's breath came short and sharp. She opened the refrigerator. Milk. Eggs. Butter. Fresh vegetables in the crisper. Everything someone with a baby would need. Everything she'd been rationing and stretching and going without. The bedroom was worse. Better. Impossible. A real bed with a frame and a headboard, made up with clean sheets. And in the corner, catching afternoon light like something from a dream she'd stopped letting herself have, a crib. White wood. New. A mobile hanging above it with soft fabric stars. Harriette sank onto the bed before her legs could give out. Susan woke with a small protest, blinking up at her with those gray eyes that saw everything and understood nothing. The same eyes that would ask questions someday. The same eyes Harriette had been terrified she'd have to watch go hungry. The note had said the debt was paid. But what debt? She didn't know anyone named Vladimiro. Didn't know anyone in the life he led, the world he ruled. She was nobody. A waitress who'd gotten pregnant by a man who'd promised everything and delivered nothing before disappearing into whatever hole men like that crawled into. Unless. Harriette's hands stilled on Susan's back. Her mind raced backward, tripping over memories she'd tried to bury. David. Susan's father. The man who'd loved her urgently and desperately for 3 months before vanishing the day she told him she was pregnant. She'd never known his last name. He'd always laughed when she asked, said it didn't matter, that they were just David and Harriette, and that was enough. She'd believed him because she'd been young and stupid and so desperate to be loved. He'd had a tattoo on his ribs. She could see it now, traced in memory, a serpent coiled around a sword. The same symbol on Costa Vladimiro's ring. Harriette stood abruptly, crossed to the window, stared down at the street where normal people lived normal lives. A man in a dark suit stood on the corner. Too still. Too watchful. When a car passed, he didn't move. When a mother with a stroller walked by, his eyes followed her building. Costa's man. Had to be. She was being watched. Protected or imprisoned, she couldn't tell. The apartment wasn't a gift. It was a cage. A beautiful, warm, safe cage that her daughter desperately needed. And Harriette had no idea what she was supposed to pay for it. Harriette had $48 in her bank account and a daughter who needed her to be smarter than this. But smart had stopped meaning anything the moment she'd found that key. Smart would have been staying in the apartment, accepting the gift, asking no questions. Smart would have been grateful. Harriette had never been good at grateful. She found the address in a way that should have been harder, asked Jerry, the night cook, who asked his cousin, who knew a guy. That was how information worked in this city. Everything connected back to Costa Vladimiro eventually, like all roads leading to Rome, except Rome wore expensive suits and left $0 tips. The building was in the warehouse district, which told her everything she needed to know. Legitimate businesses didn't operate out of converted industrial spaces with blacked-out windows and men smoking cigarettes by unmarked doors. She'd left Susan with Mrs. Chin, the only person she trusted, with a promise to be back in 2 hours and a lie about a job interview. The key and deed were in her purse, heavy as stones. The man by the door looked her up and down with the kind of assessment that cataloged threats. She clearly didn't register as one. He was young, maybe 25, with a scar through his left eyebrow and the posture of someone who knew how to hurt people. Lost? His voice was flat, bored. I need to see Costa Vladimiro. That got his attention. His eyes sharpened. You got an appointment? No. Then you don't need to see him. Harriette reached into her purse. The man's hand moved to his waistband in a flash, and she froze, suddenly aware of how catastrophically stupid this was. She was going to die in a warehouse district because she couldn't accept help, and Susan was going to grow up without a mother, and it was all because Harriette's pride was bigger than her sense. I'm getting a key, she said slowly. Just a key. He gave it to me. I'm giving it back. The man's hand didn't move. Show me. Slowly. She pulled out the key by its ring, letting it dangle between them. The man stared at it, and something shifted in his expression. Not fear exactly, but a careful kind of respect, like she'd just shown him a grenade and he wasn't sure if the pin was in. He pulled out his phone, turned away, spoke in rapid Italian she couldn't follow. When he turned back, his whole demeanor had changed. 3rd floor. Elevators broke. Take the stairs. He pulled the door open. Don't touch nothing. Don't talk to nobody. Just go straight up. The building's interior was exactly what she'd expected: concrete floors, exposed pipes, the smell of metal, and something else she didn't want to identify. Her footsteps echoed up the stairwell. Each floor she climbed made her heart pound harder, made the voice in her head scream louder that this was wrong, dangerous, the kind of mistake people didn't recover from. The third floor opened into a wide space divided by half walls and frosted glass. She could hear voices low, tense, the kind of conversation that had weight. A man appeared around the corner, older, well-dressed, with eyes that took her apart in seconds. "You the waitress?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. "Wait here. Don't move." He disappeared through a door. Harriette stood in the hallway, clutching her purse, counting her heartbeats. 37. 42. 51. The door opened. The man gestured her forward. The room was large, sparse, dominated by a conference table where 5 men sat like judges at a trial. Costa was at the head, and the moment Harriette saw him, she understood the difference between seeing a lion at the zoo and seeing one in the wild. In the diner, he'd been contained, controlled. Here, he was something else entirely. He didn't look surprised to see her. That was somehow worse. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice cutting through the sudden silence. "Take 5. Nobody moved. One of the men, thick-necked, expensive watch, the kind of face that had broken noses before, leaned back in his chair. "We're in the middle of something. And now we're taking 5. Costa's tone didn't change, but the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. The men stood, slowly, making a point of their displeasure. As they filed past Harriette, one of them, the thick-necked one, let his eyes crawl over her in a way that made her skin itch. "Pretty thing," he muttered. "Didn't know you were shopping at diners now, Costa." Costa moved so fast Harriette barely tracked it. One moment he was seated, the next he had the man against the wall, forearm across his throat, the thick-neck's face going red. "Say another word about her, and they'll find pieces of you in 3 states. Costa's voice was conversational, almost pleasant. "We clear, Marcus?" Marcus couldn't speak, just nodded frantically. Costa released him and stepped back, adjusting his cuffs like nothing had happened. Marcus stumbled toward the door, the other men following in silence. Then it was just the 2 of them. Costa turned to face her fully, and Harriette saw what she'd missed in the diner's dim light. He was younger than she'd thought, maybe 35, with the kind of face that would have been handsome if it weren't so carefully empty. But his eyes weren't empty. They were watching her with an intensity that made her want to run. "You came to return the key," he said. "Not a question." Harriette's hand shook as she pulled it from her purse, set it on the table with the deed. "I don't know what you think this is, but I can't accept it. I don't know you. I don't owe you. And I don't want to. Your daughter's father was David Morris. He went by his mother's name." Costa moved around the table, each step deliberate. "His real name was David Vladimiro. He was my blood, my cousin. And he died 2 years ago taking a bullet meant for me." The floor tilted. Harriette grabbed the table's edge. "You're lying." "I've never lied to you, Harriette." He stopped 3 feet away, close enough that she could see the scar along his jawline, the exhaustion bruised beneath his eyes. "David loved you. Talked about you constantly. When he found out you were pregnant, he was terrified and ecstatic. He was coming to tell you the truth about who he was when they found him." "No." The word came out broken. "The apartment isn't charity. It's blood debt. David died protecting me. I protect what he loved. That's you. That's Susan." Costa's voice gentled, just slightly. "You can hate me. You can refuse to speak to me. But you will take that key and you will keep my goddaughter safe." Harriette's vision blurred. She wanted to scream, to rage, to demand proof. But somewhere deep down, in the part of her that had never stopped wondering why David had that tattoo, why he'd always paid in cash, why he'd known how to fight like someone trained for war, she knew Costa was telling the truth. "I don't want your world," she whispered. "I know." Costa picked up the key, pressed it into her shaking palm, closed her fingers around it. "But it's the only one I have to give. What would you do if the life you'd been running from turned out to be the only one keeping you safe?" Drop your thoughts below and subscribe for the next part of the story. Costa poured 2 glasses of whiskey from a bottle that probably cost more than Harriette's monthly rent used to. Because apparently she didn't have rent anymore. Apparently she had an apartment bought with blood money and a daughter whose father had a real last name she'd never known. "I don't drink," she said. "Today you do." He slid 1 glass across the table. "Sit." It wasn't a request. Harriette sat, but she didn't touch the glass. Costa remained standing, looking out the window at the city sprawling below like he owned every brick and streetlight. Maybe he did. David was 7 when I was 10, he began, voice low and steady, like he'd practiced this. Or like he was too tired to pretend anymore. His mother, my Aunt Elena, she died when he was 12. Overdose. After that, my father took him in. Raised him like a son. Like my brother. Harriette's throat tightened. David had told her he was an orphan. That much, at least, had been true. We were close. Closer than most brothers are. He was good at things I wasn't, talking to people, making them laugh, making them feel safe. Costa's jaw tightened. I was good at the other things. The things our family needed. By the time we were in our 20s, David was my right hand. Not because he was vicious, but because people trusted him. He could walk into a room and make enemies into allies. He told me he worked in imports. The words tasted bitter. He did. Just not the legal kind. Costa finally turned to face her. I won't lie to you about what we are, Harriette. My family moves things that shouldn't be moved. We collect debts. We enforce rules in places where the law doesn't reach. David knew that world. He chose it. Did he choose to die in it? The question hung between them like smoke. Costa's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, something that looked almost human. No, that choice was made for him. He picked up his own glass, drained half of it in one swallow. 3 years ago, there was a territorial dispute. The Calabrese family thought they could expand into our operations. Thought if they hit us hard enough, fast enough, we'd fold. They were wrong, but not before they cost us blood. Harriette's hands twisted in her lap. She didn't want to hear this. Didn't want David to be real in this way, violent and dangerous and part of something that got people killed. David was at a meeting. Neutral ground, supposed to be safe. I was there too. 20 men in a restaurant that had been in my family for 40 years. Costa set the glass down with a sharp click. The Calabrese sent a boy, 17, strapped with enough explosives to level the building. A suicide bomber walking through the front door with dead eyes and a trigger in his hand. Harriette's breath stopped. David saw him first. Saw what he was. Everyone else was focused on the negotiation, on posturing and threats. Costa's voice went flat, empty. David didn't hesitate. He tackled the kid, wrapped himself around him, and dragged him toward the kitchen, away from the tables. Away from me. The room spun. Harriette gripped the edge of the table. They made it to the walk-in freezer before the kid detonated. The blast was contained. David's body took most of it. Costa's eyes met hers, and they were filled with something she'd never expected to see there, grief. Raw and old and never properly buried. He saved 23 people that day. Including me. They found enough of him to bury, but barely. The tears came before Harriette could stop them, hot and sudden and furious. She'd mourned David as a coward who'd abandoned her. Had hated him for leaving her pregnant and alone. Had told herself he was weak, selfish, not worth the love she'd wasted on him. But he died a hero. Had died saving lives. Had died before he ever knew for certain that Susan existed. He knew about the pregnancy, Costa said quietly. You told him the day before the meeting. He called me that night, drunk and terrified and happier than I'd ever heard him. Said he was going to quit. Going to walk away from the family, from the business, from all of it. He just needed to get through one more negotiation. Harriette pressed her hands to her face, shoulders shaking. Why didn't you tell me? Why did you let me think he'd just left? Because I didn't know where you were. Costa moved around the table, crouched down so they were eye level. David was paranoid about keeping you separate from this world. He never told me your full name, where you worked, where you lived. Just Harriette and stories about how you made him want to be better. After he died, I searched. For months. But you'd moved, changed jobs, disappeared. I was running from debt collectors. From his debts. The irony tasted like acid. Those weren't his debts. They were predators who heard a young woman had lost her man and thought they could exploit it. Something dangerous flashed across Costa's face. Give me names. I'll handle it. They're already gone. I paid them. With money she'd needed for food, for rent, for surviving. Costa stood, pulled something from his jacket pocket. A photograph, worn at the edges like it had been handled often. He placed it on the table in front of her. It was David. Younger, maybe 19, grinning at the camera with his arm around Costa's shoulders. Both of them looked happy. Looked like brothers. "He made me promise," Costa said. "The night before he died. Made me swear on our family name that if anything happened to him, I'd find you. I'd make sure you and the baby were safe. That you'd never want for anything." His voice roughened. "I don't break promises to the dead, Harriette. Especially not to him." Harriette picked up the photograph with shaking hands. Susan had David's smile. She'd noticed it before but hadn't wanted to see it, hadn't wanted to remember him as anything but the ghost who'd left her. Now she saw him clearly, the man Costa described, the one who'd loved her enough to die protecting strangers, who'd wanted to leave everything behind for a chance at a normal life. "The apartment," she whispered, "the furniture, the formula, all of it. And there's more. A trust fund for Susan's education. Health insurance. Whatever you need." Costa's expression was carved from granite. "I failed David by letting him die. I won't fail him by letting his family struggle." "I'm not family. You're the mother of his child. That makes you blood." He said it with such finality that arguing felt impossible. "In my world, blood is everything. It's the only thing that matters when everything else burns." Harriette looked at the photograph, at David's smile, at the life she'd never truly known. Susan deserved to know her father had been brave. Deserved more than the story of abandonment Harriette had been preparing to tell her. "I need time," she said finally, "to process this. To figure out what it means. Take all the time you need. But you'll do it from the apartment. With my men watching your building. With my doctor on call for Susan." Costa's tone left no room for negotiation. "I've already lost David. I won't lose what's left of him." It wasn't a request. It was a vow. And Harriette realized, sitting in that warehouse with a dead man's photograph in her hands and a crime lord's oath hanging in the air, that she'd stopped running the moment she'd walked through that apartment door. Some debts couldn't be paid back. They could only be lived with. Harriette went back to work on Thursday. She told herself it was because she needed the normalcy, the familiar rhythm of coffee pots and order tickets and complaints about overcooked eggs. The truth was simpler and more complicated. She didn't know how to be the person who lived in that apartment, who accepted protection from a man whose world was built on violence. Being a waitress was the only identity she had left that made sense. Jerry raised an eyebrow when she walked through the kitchen door. "Thought you quit." "Why would I quit?" "Because you looked like you were going to your own execution on Tuesday. Figured you'd finally had enough of this place." He flipped a burger with practiced indifference. "Plus, word is you came into some money." Harriette's blood went cold. "Word from who?" Jerry shrugged. "You know how it is. People talk. People talk because Costa's people talk," she thought. Because nothing in this city happened without him knowing about it, without his shadow falling across it. She tied her apron with more force than necessary and pushed through to the floor. The dinner rush was typical for a Thursday. Construction workers, a few families, the usual regulars nursing coffee and existential dread. Harriette fell into the rhythm like muscle memory, letting the familiar movements quiet the chaos in her head. Take the order. Deliver the food. Smile even when you want to scream. Survive. It was around 7 when she noticed them. 2 men sitting in a booth by the window. They'd ordered coffee an hour ago and hadn't touched it. One was reading a newspaper, an actual physical newspaper that nobody under 60 carried anymore. The other was just watching. Not her specifically, but the door. The street. The other customers. His eyes moved in constant assessment, cataloging threats. They were Costa's men. Had to be. Harriette's hands trembled as she poured coffee for table 6. She'd known, logically, that Costa had said he'd have people watching. But knowing and seeing were different things. Seeing made it real. Made her complicit. She was refilling the newspaper man's cold coffee when the door chimed and Marcus walked in. Marcus. The regular who wasn't quite a regular, who came in every few weeks and always sat at the counter and always made her skin crawl. He was in his 40s, thick around the middle, with hands that liked to brush against hers when she handed him his change. He'd asked her out 6 times. She'd said no 7, because once she'd had to say it twice in the same conversation. Tonight, he was drunk. She could tell by the way he walked, by the volume of his voice when he called her name. Harriette, there's my favorite girl. He dropped onto a counter stool with enough force to make it wobble. Heard you moved. Heard you got yourself a sugar daddy. The diner went quiet in that way that meant everyone was listening while pretending not to. What can I get you, Marcus? Her voice was professional, flat. How about an explanation? How about you tell me how a waitress affords a place on Maple Street? He leaned forward, beer breath hot and sour. Or maybe you can tell me why you wouldn't go out with me, but you'll spread your he didn't get to finish. The newspaper man was behind him in a movement so fast and fluid it seemed impossible for someone that size. One hand landed on Marcus's shoulder, heavy as a headstone. You're done here. The voice was accented, Eastern European, polite as a funeral director. Marcus tried to turn, couldn't. The hell? Get your hands off me. You're going to stand up. You're going to walk out. You're going to forget this diner exists. The grip tightened. Marcus's face went pale. Or I'm going to break things that don't heal right. We clear. I'm a paying customer. The hand shifted, did something Harriette couldn't see. Marcus made a sound like a stepped-on dog. We clear, the man repeated. Yeah, yes, clear. Marcus practically fell off the stool in his rush to stand. He stumbled toward the door without looking back, without another word. The newspaper man returned to his booth like nothing had happened. Picked up his coffee. Took a sip. Went back to reading about sports scores from 3 days ago. Every customer in the diner suddenly found their plates fascinating. Harriette stood behind the counter, heart hammering, hands gripped white on the coffee pot. She wanted to scream. Wanted to march over to that booth and demand they leave. Demand Costa call off his watchdogs. Demand her life back. But Marcus had been coming to the diner for 8 months. And for 8 months, she'd endured his comments, his implications, his hands that touched too long and too low. She'd smiled through it because she needed the job, needed the tips, needed to survive. She'd made herself small and polite and unthreatening because that was what women like her did to get through the day. And in 30 seconds, Costa's man had ended it. The rest of her shift passed in a blur. When she went to clear the booth at 9, the 2 men were gone. They'd left $40 for 2 cups of coffee they'd never drunk. She walked home, walked to the apartment that was supposedly hers now in the dark. Maple Street was quiet, tree-lined, the kind of neighborhood where people jogged at night without fear. She climbed the stairs to 3B with Susan drowsy in her carrier, unlocked the door to warmth and light and safety. There was a note on the kitchen counter. Heavy paper, precise handwriting. Marcus Renly will not trouble you again. Neither will anyone else. You are under Vladimiro protection now. That means something in this city. See, Harriette crumpled the note in her fist, then smoothed it out again, then crumpled it once more. She didn't know if she wanted to cry or throw something. Didn't know if what she felt was gratitude or rage or some toxic mixture of both. She'd spent her entire adult life fighting to be independent, to need no one, to prove she could survive on her own terms. And now a man she barely knew had wrapped her in a protection she'd never asked for, had solved problems with the threat of violence, had made her safe in a way that felt like a beautiful prison. Susan stirred in her carrier, made a small sound of discontent. Harriette lifted her out, held her close, breathed in that perfect baby smell that made everything simultaneously better and worse. Your father saved people, she whispered against Susan's wispy hair. And now his cousin is saving us. I don't know if that makes us lucky or cursed. Susan yawned, unimpressed with existential dilemmas. Through the window, Harriette could see a car parked across the street. Could see the silhouette of a man inside, watching. Always watching. She closed the curtains and tried to pretend she wasn't grateful for the shadow standing between her and the dark. When protection feels like a cage, is it still freedom? Share your thoughts and subscribe. The invitation came on a Tuesday, delivered by a woman in a charcoal suit who looked like she'd stepped out of a corporate boardroom rather than a crime syndicate. She was waiting outside the diner when Harriette's shift ended, leaning against a black Mercedes with the kind of casual confidence that came from never having been told no. Ms. Morris. I'm Angela Rossini, Mr. Vladimiro's executive assistant. She said it like that was a normal job title for a man who broke bones for a living. Mr. Vladimiro requests your presence for dinner tomorrow evening. You and your daughter. A car will collect you at 6. I didn't agree to anything, Harriette said, adjusting Susan's carrier on her hip. It's not optional. Angela's smile was professional and utterly inflexible. There's been an incident. Mr. Vladimiro believes you'll be safer at the estate until the situation is resolved. What kind of incident? The kind that's above my pay grade to discuss on a public street. Angela opened the car door. 6 o'clock, Ms. Morris. Please be ready. She drove away before Harriette could argue, leaving her standing on the sidewalk with a sleeping baby and a growing sense of dread. The car that arrived the next evening was different, a black SUV with windows tinted so dark they might as well have been painted. The driver was one of Costa's men, silent and efficient, holding the door open like Harriette was someone who mattered. She dressed Susan in the nicest outfit she had, a small pink dress from a thrift store that was only slightly faded. For herself, she'd chosen the one dress she owned that wasn't stained or threadbare, a navy blue thing she'd bought for a job interview 3 years ago. She felt ridiculous. Underdressed and overdressed simultaneously. The drive took 40 minutes, the city giving way to suburbs and then to something else entirely, estates hidden behind stone walls and iron gates, the kind of wealth that didn't advertise itself because it didn't need to. When they turned through a gate flanked by stone pillars, Harriette's stomach dropped. The manor rose from landscaped grounds like something from another century. 3 stories of pale stone and tall windows, with wings extending to either side and gardens that probably required a full-time staff. It was beautiful in the way that museums were beautiful, impressive and cold, and entirely removed from anything resembling her life. The driver opened her door. Mr. Vladimiro is waiting in the east parlor. Of course there was an east parlor. Probably a west one too. Probably rooms with names Harriette had never heard of. A woman in a housekeeper's uniform met them at the door, her expression warm in a way that felt genuine. Ms. Morris, welcome. I'm Rosa. Let me take your coat. Oh, what a beautiful baby. Susan, for her part, seemed unimpressed with the marble floors and crystal chandelier overhead. She was hungry and making sure everyone knew it. There's a room prepared upstairs if you need privacy to feed her, Rosa said, already leading the way down a hallway lined with art that probably cost more than Harriette's entire existence. I can manage here, Harriette said, because accepting more felt like sliding further into a world she didn't belong in. Nonsense. Come. The room Rosa led her to was smaller than the entrance hall, but larger than Harriette's entire studio apartment had been. A sitting room with soft chairs and warm lighting and a side table already set with water and fresh fruit. Harriette settled into a chair and began nursing Susan, who latched on immediately, crisis averted. That was when Costa appeared in the doorway. He stopped short, and something flickered across his face, surprise, maybe, or discomfort. I apologize. Rosa said you'd arrived. I didn't realize, it's fine. Harriette adjusted the blanket over Susan, suddenly hyper-aware of how domestic this was, how vulnerable. You can come in. It's your house. He entered carefully, like he was approaching something fragile. He'd traded his usual dark suit for something slightly less formal, still expensive, still perfectly tailored, but without the tie. It made him look younger. Almost human. Thank you for coming, he said, remaining standing. I know this isn't what you wanted. Your assistant said there was an incident. The Calabrese family is making moves. They know about you. About Susan. His jaw tightened. I've handled it, but until the situation is fully resolved, you're safer here. Fear spiked through her chest. How do they know about us? Because information is currency in my world, and someone sold yours. He said it matter-of-factly, but there was something lethal underneath. That person won't be selling anything again. Harriette didn't ask what that meant. Didn't want to know. Susan finished eating and immediately spit up on Harriette's shoulder because babies had no sense of timing. Harriette grabbed the burp cloth too late, and warm milk soaked into her dress. Perfect, she muttered. This is literally the only nice thing I own. Rosa can have it cleaned. I'll have her bring you something else. I don't want something else. I don't want any of this. The words came out sharper than she'd intended, edged with exhaustion and fear and the overwhelming wrongness of sitting in a mansion while people who killed for a living discussed her daughter like a chess piece. Costa was quiet for a moment. Then he moved closer, slowly, and held out his hands. May I? Harriette blinked. May you what? Hold her. So you can change. It was such an unexpected request that Harriette almost laughed. This man, who'd crushed someone's throat for insulting her, wanted to hold a baby. You don't have to, I know. His hands stayed extended. But David would have wanted me to know her. And I'd like to, if you'll allow it. There was something in his voice that made refusing feel cruel. Harriette shifted Susan into his arms, half expecting the baby to scream at this stranger's touch. Instead, Susan blinked up at him with solemn gray eyes, David's eyes, and yawned. Costa held her with surprising competence, supporting her head, keeping her secure against his chest. He looked down at her with an expression Harriette had never seen on his face before. Something soft. Something that looked almost like grief. She has his nose, he said quietly. And his expression when he's thinking. He used to look exactly like this when he was trying to figure something out. You've held babies before. 3 nephews. 2 nieces. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. In my family, children are sacred. Protected above all else. He swayed slightly, a natural rocking motion, and Susan's eyes began to drift closed. Harriette watched this man, this dangerous, lethal man, gentle his daughter to sleep with the kind of careful tenderness that didn't match anything else about him. The dinner, she said. Is it really just dinner? No. Costa's eyes met hers over Susan's head. It's a message. To every family in this city. That you and Susan are under my personal protection. That anyone who touches you will answer to me. His voice hardened. And when I make an example, people remember. You're using us to make a point. I'm using every resource I have to keep you alive. He shifted Susan slightly, and she sighed in her sleep, completely content. The dinner is political theater. But my oath to David is real. You can hate me for the methods. That won't change the outcome. Rosa returned with a blouse, still warm from the dryer. Harriette changed quickly while Costa continued holding Susan, murmuring something in Italian too quiet for Harriette to catch. When she was ready, he handed Susan back with visible reluctance. Dinner is served whenever you're comfortable. There will be others present, my captains, their wives. They need to see you. To understand that you're family now. I'm not family. Yes, Costa said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. You are. The dining room was designed to intimidate. Harriette understood that the moment she walked in, the long table that could seat 20, the artwork that looked like it belonged in museums, the chandelier dripping crystal like frozen tears. 8 people were already seated, men in expensive suits and women draped in jewelry that caught the light with every breath. They all turned to look at her simultaneously, and the weight of their assessment was nearly physical. Costa stood at the head of the table, and the relief Harriette felt at seeing a familiar face, even his, told her how far she'd fallen into this world. Everyone, this is Harriette Morris and her daughter, Susan. His introduction carried the finality of a gavel strike. David's family, which makes them ours. The proclamation hung in the air. Then a woman in emerald silk stood, her smile warm and genuine. I'm Lucia. David was at my wedding. He got drunk and sang Sinatra until my husband had to carry him out. She laughed, the sound surprisingly light. Please sit. Anyone David loved is welcome here. The tension broke. People resumed conversations, passed bread, poured wine. Harriette took the seat beside Costa with Susan in her carrier at her feet, feeling like an imposter at a table where everyone else knew the rules. The food was extraordinary, courses Harriette couldn't name, wine that probably cost more than her monthly salary used to. She picked at her plate while the conversation flowed around her, talk of shipping schedules and territory disputes dressed up in euphemisms that weren't fooling anyone. Costa leaned toward her, his voice low. You're not eating. I'm not hungry. You're terrified. Can you blame me? She glanced at the faces around the table, these people who smiled and laughed and discussed murder like it was quarterly earnings. This isn't my world. No, he agreed. But it's Susan's legacy. David's blood runs in her veins. That means something here. Before Harriette could respond, the lights went out. Not flickering. Not a brownout. Complete, sudden darkness that swallowed the room whole. The conversation stopped. In the silence, Harriette heard the distinctive sound of safeties clicking off, of weapons being drawn. Someone had a gun. Multiple people had guns. Costa's hand found her arm in the dark, grip firm. Don't move. What's happening? Quiet. Then came the sound of breaking glass from somewhere deeper in the house. Shouting. A gunshot that cracked through the air like a whip, then another, then a whole volley that made Harriette's ears ring. Emergency lighting kicked in, bathing everything in red. Costa was already moving, pulling her up by the arm. Get Susan. Now. Harriette's hands shook as she grabbed the carrier. Susan was awake, starting to whimper, sensing the fear that saturated the air. Around them, the other guests were scattering, women being ushered toward one exit, men drawing weapons and moving toward the gunfire like they'd trained for this. Because they had. This was their normal. Costa's hand pressed against Harriette's back, propelling her forward. This way. Stay close. What about, they can handle themselves? You can't. He was moving fast, navigating the manor in the crimson light like he'd memorized every inch. They went down a hallway, through a door, down a set of stairs that Harriette nearly fell down twice. More gunfire, closer now. Susan was crying in earnest, and Harriette wanted to join her. The basement was concrete and shadow. Costa led her past storage rooms and wine cellars to a heavy door that looked like it belonged in a bank vault. He spun the combination lock with practiced speed, hauled the door open. Inside. It was a safe room. Had to be. Reinforced walls, a ventilation system, shelves stocked with supplies. And weapons. So many weapons mounted on the far wall that Harriette's stomach turned. Costa pulled her inside, sealed the door behind them. The sound of gunfire became muffled, distant. He crossed to a panel on the wall, flipped switches. Monitors flickered to life, showing security feeds from throughout the house. On the screens, Harriette could see them, men in dark tactical gear moving through the manor in organized teams. Could see Costa's people fighting back, the bright muzzle flashes like lightning. Could see bodies falling, though she couldn't tell which side they were on. The Calabrese, she asked, though she already knew. Or someone they hired. Costa's attention was fixed on the monitors, his jaw set. They chose tonight because you were here. Wanted to make a statement. This is my fault. This is their mistake. He touched his earpiece, spoke rapidly in Italian. Whatever response he got made his expression darken. He switched to English. West Wing is compromised. Fall back to secondary positions. No one gets to the vault. The vault. Where they were. Where Susan was. Harriette sank onto a bench, holding Susan close, trying to muffle her cries against her shoulder. How long do we have to stay here? Until it's over. And if your people lose? Costa finally looked at her, and his eyes held something cold and absolute. They won't. An explosion somewhere above them made the walls shake. Dust rained from the ceiling. Susan screamed, and Harriette's composure shattered with her. We're going to die here. Susan is going to die here because Costa crossed the space between them in 2 strides, crouched in front of her, his hands gripping her shoulders. Listen to me. I have 30 men in this house. Another 20 surrounding the property. The Calabrese brought maybe 15. This attack is already over. They just don't know it yet. You can't be sure, I'm always sure. He released one shoulder to touch Susan's head, his massive hand covering her tiny skull with surprising gentleness. I swore to David I would protect you. I don't break oaths, Harriette. Not to the living and especially not to the dead. His certainty should have been arrogant. Instead, it was just exhausting. This was his world, violence and strategy and calculating odds while bullets flew. Harriette had spent her whole life just trying to survive, and here was a man who treated survival like a chess game he'd already won. On the monitors, the tide was turning. She could see it in the way the tactical teams were retreating, in the bodies, so many bodies, littering Costa's beautiful floors. The gunfire was becoming sporadic, isolated pops instead of sustained volleys. Costa stood, watching the screens with the focus of a general. He touched his earpiece again. Status. Whatever he heard made him nod. Sweep every room. I want counts and identities within the hour. And someone clean up the dining room before the wine stains the carpet. He said it so matter-of-factly that Harriette almost laughed. Almost. Instead, she pressed her face against Susan's hair and tried not to think about how close they'd come to being casualties in someone else's war. It's over, Costa said, turning back to her. They're gone. The house is secure. For now. For now, he agreed. Which is why you're not going back to the apartment. You're staying here, where I can protect you properly. I can't live in your house. You can and you will. His tone left no room for argument. The Calabrese made their move tonight. When I respond, it will be definitive. But until then, you and Susan stay under my roof and my guard. Harriette wanted to fight. Wanted to rage against being moved around like a piece on his board. But Susan was still shaking in her arms, and the sound of gunfire still echoed in her ears, and she was so tired of pretending she was strong enough to face this alone. Okay, she whispered. Okay. Costa's expression softened, just slightly. I'll have Rosa prepare rooms for you. Anything you need, ask. I need this to be over. Soon, he said, and it sounded like a promise. Soon. The manor settled into an uneasy quiet after midnight. Rosa had prepared a suite on the 3rd floor, bedroom, sitting room, a nursery that looked like something from a magazine spread. Susan had finally exhausted herself into sleep, her small chest rising and falling in the elaborate crib that probably cost more than every piece of furniture Harriette had ever owned combined. Harriette stood at the window, watching shadows move across the grounds. Costa's men, patrolling. Always watching. She'd counted 6 different guards in the last hour alone, their paths intersecting and overlapping like some choreographed dance of violence. The knock on her door was soft, almost apologetic. Come in, she said, though she already knew who it would be. Costa entered carrying 2 mugs, steam rising from both. He'd changed out of his dinner clothes into dark slacks and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up. It was the most casual she'd ever seen him, and somehow that made him more dangerous, not less. Like seeing the man underneath the armor. Rosa made tea. Said it would help you sleep. He offered her one of the mugs. I told her you probably wouldn't, but she insisted. Harriette took it because refusing felt petty. The warmth seeped into her hands. Shouldn't you be downstairs doing whatever it is you do after people try to kill you? Giving orders from up here works just as well. He moved to the other window, keeping a careful distance between them. My people are handling cleanup. The police have been notified that it was a gas leak. The neighbors will believe it because they always believe what they're told to believe. A gas leak that required 40 rounds of ammunition? People hear what they want to hear. He sipped his tea, and the domesticity of the gesture felt absurd. You should try to rest. Tomorrow will be difficult. Why? Because I'm going to end this. And you're going to hear things about me that will make you question whether you can stay under the same roof. Harriette turned to face him fully. In the low light, the scar on his jaw was more pronounced, and the shadows under his eyes spoke of too many nights like this one. I already know what you are, Costa. You don't have to protect me from the truth. Knowing and witnessing are different things. His voice carried the weight of experience. David tried to keep that separation. Tried to show you only the man he wanted to be, not the one the family needed. I don't have that luxury. Is that why you're here? To warn me about what's coming? No. He set his mug down on the windowsill with careful precision. I'm here because I owe you honesty. And because after tonight, you deserve to know why I'm doing this. You already told me. Blood oath. David's last request. That's part of it. Costa's jaw tightened. But it's not all of it, and pretending otherwise is a lie I'm tired of telling. Harriette's pulse quickened. She wasn't sure she wanted to hear this. Wasn't sure she could handle another revelation in a night already overflowing with them. Costa turned to face her, and his expression was more open than she'd ever seen it, vulnerable in a way that seemed physically painful for him. I saw you before I ever sat down in that diner. 6 months before. You were outside on your break, sitting on the curb because there was nowhere else to sit. Susan was maybe 2 months old. You were feeding her with one hand and eating a sandwich with the other, and you looked so tired I thought you might fall asleep right there on the street. Harriette remembered that day. Remembered how the exhaustion had felt like drowning, how she'd seriously considered just lying down on the pavement and letting the world go on without her. I watched you finish eating, Costa continued, and then you stood up, straightened your uniform, and went back inside like you weren't barely holding yourself together. Like you had the strength to do another 4 hours even though you clearly didn't. He paused. I've seen soldiers with less fortitude. Seen grown men break under pressure you carry every single day without complaint. What does this have to do with I came back the next week? And the week after? Always late, when the diner was quiet, because I wanted to see if that strength was real or just a moment. His eyes held hers. It was real. Every time. You never broke. Never quit. Even when that drunk threw coffee at you, even when you were clearly sick, even when Susan was crying in the back and you were juggling 6 tables alone. You just kept going. Harriette's throat tightened. You were watching me. Yes. That's intrusive. Inappropriate. I know. He didn't look away. But I couldn't stop. Because everyone in my life either fears me or wants something from me. But you? You looked at me like I was just another customer. Like I was nobody. And I realized I hadn't been nobody in 20 years. The confession hung between them, raw and unexpected. Harriette set down her mug before she could drop it. So what? You developed some kind of obsession? No. I developed respect. Costa's voice was quiet but firm. When I found out who you were, when I realized you were David's Harriette, the woman he died still loving, it felt like fate. Like the universe giving me permission to do what I'd already wanted to do. Which was protect you, provide for you, make sure that strength didn't break because the world was too cruel to someone who deserved better. Harriette's hands trembled. She clasped them together, trying to steady herself. You don't know me, Costa. You've seen me serve coffee. That's not the same as knowing someone. I know you work double shifts and never complain. I know you sing to Susan when you think no one's listening. I know you tip out the busboy even on nights when you barely made minimum wage. He took a step closer. I know you're terrified right now, but you're standing here anyway, because that's what you do. You face things even when they scare you. Stop. I know you haven't let yourself want anything in years because wanting feels dangerous. I said stop. Her voice broke. You can't say things like that. Why not? Because I'm nobody. I'm a waitress with a baby and nothing else. She gestured helplessly at the room, the manor, the world he inhabited. You're this. And this isn't real. None of this is real. Costa closed the distance between them, stopping just close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. The attack tonight was real. The men who died protecting you were real. My oath to keep you safe is real. His voice dropped. And what I feel when I look at you is real, whether you believe it or not. Harriette's breath caught. You don't feel anything. You're just trying to honor David's memory. David's memory is why I found you. It's not why I stayed. He lifted his hand slowly, giving her time to pull away, and brushed a strand of hair from her face with a gentleness that contradicted everything else about him. You fascinate me, Harriette Morris. Your strength. Your stubbornness. The way you love that little girl with everything you have even when you have nothing left to give. Costa, I'm not asking you to feel the same way. I'm not asking you for anything except to let me keep you safe. But I needed you to know that this, he gestured between them, isn't just obligation. It stopped being just obligation the 3rd time I sat in your section, and you smiled at me like I was human. Tears burned in Harriette's eyes. She wanted to deny it, to push him away, to retreat behind the walls she'd built so carefully. But she was exhausted from holding up those walls, and his honesty had stripped her defenses bare. I don't know how to do this, she whispered. I don't know how to be what you think I am. You don't have to be anything except exactly who you are. Costa's hand fell away, but he didn't step back. I'll take whatever you're willing to give. Even if it's nothing. They stood there in the quiet, the space between them charged with possibility and fear. Outside, guards patrolled. Downstairs, men cleaned blood from marble floors. And in the nursery, Susan slept peacefully, unaware that her mother's carefully controlled world was fracturing into something new and terrifying. "I'm scared," Harriette finally admitted. "I know. Not just of your world. Of this. Of you." "That's smart." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "I'm a dangerous man, Harriette. But not to you. Never to you." When strength meets protection, does it become something more? Drop your thoughts below and subscribe for the final story. 3 months after the attack, Harriette stood in an office that still didn't feel like hers, reviewing grant applications for the Vladimiro Foundation. The nameplate on her desk read Director of Community Outreach, and every time she saw it, a part of her waited for someone to realize the mistake and take it away. The foundation funded after-school programs, food banks, housing assistance for single mothers. All legal. All legitimate. Costa had created it years ago, tax shelter or genuine altruism. She still wasn't sure, but he'd meant it when he said he wanted her to run it. Had sat her down with lawyers and accountants, handed her a budget that made her dizzy, and told her to help people the way she wished someone had helped her. It was the kind of power she'd never imagined having. The kind that meant she could look at a family about to be evicted and write a check that kept them housed. Could see a woman working 3 jobs and offer childcare assistance. Could be the miracle she'd spent years praying for. The door opened without a knock. Costa entered carrying coffee from the shop across the street, her order, oat milk latte with an extra shot, because somehow he'd memorized it. He set it on her desk alongside a folder. "The zoning board approved the community center," he said. "Construction starts next month." Harriette looked up from the application she'd been reviewing. "The one on 5th Street? The same neighborhood you used to live in. Now it'll have a safe place for kids after school, job training for adults, free legal aid." He sat in the chair across from her desk, a position that still felt strange, Costa Vladimiro sitting while she had the power seat. "You did that. You funded it. You designed it. You fought for it. You convinced the board that it was worth their time." His expression held something like pride. "Don't diminish what you've accomplished." She wanted to argue, but the truth was she had fought for it. Had spent 6 weeks navigating bureaucracy and neighborhood associations and skeptical city officials who couldn't believe a Vladimiro project might actually benefit the community. She'd used every skill she'd developed from years of managing difficult customers and impossible shifts, and somehow it had worked. "Susan's ready whenever you are," Costa added, checking his watch. "Rosa has her in the nursery." The nursery. Because of course Costa had converted a room in the office building into a full nursery, complete with a certified nanny, so Harriette could work without worrying. Had done it without asking, just presented it as fait accompli the way he did everything. She should have been annoyed by his high-handedness. Somehow, she learned to find it endearing. They walked to the nursery together, their shoulders almost touching in the hallway. Somewhere over the past 3 months, the space between them had diminished in increments so small she hadn't noticed until suddenly they were here, comfortable, familiar, something that wasn't quite a relationship but wasn't quite not one either. Susan was on a play mat, batting at hanging toys with the intense concentration of an 8-month-old scientist. The moment she saw Costa, her face split into a gummy smile and she reached up with grabbing hands. "There's my girl," Costa said, scooping her up with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this 100 times. Susan grabbed his nose, squealed with delight when he pretended it hurt. "You're getting strong. Soon you'll be running this whole operation." Harriette watched them together, this feared man and her tiny daughter, and felt something shift in her chest. Costa had been there for Susan's first laugh. Had walked the floors with her at 2 a.m. when Harriette was too exhausted to function. Had baby-proofed the entire manor without being asked and learned how to make bottles with the precision he applied to everything else. He'd become what David never got the chance to be. "I've been thinking," Harriette said as they gathered Susan's things, "about what you said that night after the attack." Costa's hands stilled on the diaper bag. "Which part?" "The part about what you feel." She kept her eyes on Susan, because looking at him while saying this felt impossible. I've been trying to convince myself it was just gratitude. That I'm only here because you saved us and gave us a life we couldn't have had otherwise. And? And I think I've been lying to myself. She finally looked up, found him watching her with an intensity that stole her breath. Because when you're late, I worry. When you come back with blood on your shirt that you think I don't notice, my heart stops. When I see you with Susan and you look at her like she's the most important thing in your world, she is, Costa interrupted quietly. You both are. The confession should have scared her. Maybe it would have, 3 months ago. But she'd spent 3 months watching him be gentle with her daughter. Watching him fight battles she'd never see to keep them safe. Watching him look at her like she was extraordinary when she'd spent her whole life feeling invisible. I don't know how to do this, Harriette admitted. This thing between us. I don't know the rules. There are no rules. Costa shifted Susan to one arm, reached out with his free hand to touch Harriette's face. Just you, me, and whatever we decide to build. Your world is dangerous. Yes. People will always be trying to hurt you. Which means they'll try to hurt us. Yes. His thumb traced her cheekbone. I can't promise you safety, Harriette. I can only promise I'll burn down anyone who tries to take you from me. It should have sounded possessive, threatening. Instead, it sounded like the most honest thing anyone had ever said to her. Harriette leaned into his touch, let herself want this for the first time without the guilt. David would have liked this. Us. You taking care of his family. David would have kicked my ass for waiting this long to tell you how I feel. Costa's smile was soft, real. He never had patience for cowardice. Is that what this was? You being a coward? Terrified. He said it without shame. Of ruining this. Of pushing you away. Of being one more man who takes from you instead of giving. Susan chose that moment to grab both their faces, smushing them together with her tiny hands. They both laughed, the tension breaking into something lighter, easier. She's demanding, Costa observed. Wonder where she gets that from, Harriette said, looking pointedly at him. They left the office as the sun set over the city, Costa carrying Susan while Harriette gathered bags. The car was waiting, always waiting, but tonight felt different. Tonight felt like the beginning of something instead of the continuation of an obligation. At the manor, Rosa had dinner ready. They ate together in the smaller dining room, the one that felt like a family space instead of a statement of power. Susan sat in a high chair between them, making a mess of mashed vegetables while Costa and Harriette talked about foundation business and zoning boards and normal things that had nothing to do with blood debts or gang wars. Later, after Susan was asleep and the house had settled into quiet, Harriette found Costa in his study. He looked up from paperwork, started to speak, but she crossed the room and kissed him before she could lose her nerve. He froze for a heartbeat, then pulled her closer, kissing her back with a gentleness that contradicted everything about his reputation. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, his hand cupped her face like she was something precious. I'm still scared, she whispered. I know. He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, the tip of her nose. Be scared. I'll be brave enough for both of us. And somehow, impossibly, Harriette believed him. She wasn't the invisible waitress anymore. Wasn't the woman barely surviving on tips and desperation. She was director of community outreach for the Vladimiro Foundation. Was the woman Costa Vladimiro looked at like she hung the moon. Was the mother of a little girl who would grow up protected by one of the most dangerous men in the city and loved by him just as fiercely. The life she had now wasn't the one she'd imagined. It was better and stranger and more complicated than anything she could have planned. Built on a foundation of blood and sacrifice, protected by shadows and violence, but real in ways her old life had never been. Costa had left a $0 tip that night in the diner. But he'd given her everything else. A home. Safety. Purpose. And slowly, carefully, with the patience of someone who understood that trust was earned in inches, he'd given her his heart. Susan would grow up knowing her father had been a hero. Would know that Costa had honored David's memory by loving what David had loved most. Would understand that family wasn't just blood, but the bonds people chose to forge in fire. And Harriette would build something good from the ashes of her old life. Would help people the way she'd needed help. Would love the man who'd seen her strength when she felt weakest. The Mafia boss had left a $0 tip. But the single mother had found everything she needed hidden beneath the plate, a second chance written in sharp, decisive ink, signed by a man who kept his promises to the dead by protecting the living. Some debts could never be repaid. They could only be lived forward, transformed into something new. Into family. Into love. Into a life worth the price it had cost to build. Human Harriette leaned back against Costa's desk, his arms around her, and looked at the future without fear for the first time in years. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For seeing me. When I was invisible." Costa's arms tightened. "You were never invisible, Harriette. You were just waiting for someone who knew how to look." And in that moment, in a crime lord's study with a sleeping baby upstairs and guards patrolling outside, Harriette Morris finally came home. Thank you for listening until the very end. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the story. There's another story like the one you just enjoyed on your left screen.